expanding its territory, its domain, and extending its boundaries. In the words of Rab Nachum Chernobyler, as he brought the interpretation on the pasuk, Ve'ela Teildis Yitzchak, Ve'ela, the Vav, what does it come to add? It comes to add and expand the Gvul HaKdusha, the boundary or the domain of holiness, through what? Through the extracting and the elevation of the divine sparks that are embedded even in the negative or in the klippa, in the shells of existence. So all this is about expanding. And like you said, there is between Seid and Sheirish, the Seid Sheirish and Seid Teisvus, that there's the energy as it is in its root, in its source, the way it was designated by the Kav Hamida, by that measuring channel that measures and creates a certain amount of energy allocated to whatever dimension, to whatever domain there is. And then there's Teisvus that increases that, which means it's not as limited. It's not that channeled energy is limited, as he said. The words he used were it's concealed, it's diminished, it's in the state of tzimtzum, contracted and diminished after diminishment. But the say Teisvus is it goes beyond the Kav Hamida, beyond that measured flow. And that is ultimately a higher air, as he calls the etzema air, that's higher than manifests inside the containers. And that's what we learned yesterday. So all this is still a discussion of air. The focus here is on bringing more divine energy or divine consciousness into our existence and to our being. He's going to continue this process, and then, as we know, we're in the middle of a discussion. By contrast, then there's the actual focus on the netzutzes themselves, as he put it, should radiate. That the keli itself becomes transformed from the darkness, gets transformed to light. Not just that it's increasing in light, because we clearly understand now that when you come to a darker place, the light becomes increased, also on a qualitative level. But it's still the focus is on the dimension of light. So now we're going to continue, and he says, "V'oidzos." So middle of the page, the line that begins Shahu. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you're following the text. If you want to follow the text, and Shahu, right? I should have added also Teisvasha Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Meruba, right? Which is that the additional what God gives is more than the ikar, than the sheirish, Teisvasha Meruba la ikar, that the dividends are greater than the principal. Just adding to this discussion. But now the Rebbe Rashab adds another thing, which means either furthermore or moreover. There's another element that's happening here in the process, because if you recall earlier, he didn't say that this is a ermal ma'ila lamata. He made it clear that even when you talk about a birur, a clarity, a separation, a clarity and refinement that's coming from the bottom up, that the animal soul itself is also yearning for godliness. Even that, the focus is still on the oir, on the divine revelation. So he's going to say, "V'oidzos shakelim is dachachim v'nasim b'pchinas kelim yeser lekabla sa'ir." In addition to extending and expanding the boundary and the territory and domain of holiness that we're discussing, that comes through Avodah, the Avodah of elevating the sparks, which means as we refine our material lives, we're expanding the domain of holiness in this world and sanctity, we're sanctifying our lives. In addition, he says, the kelim become more refined and they become more receptive and more conducive, lekabla sa'ir, to receive the divine and the energy, that the air should radiate within them and illuminate them with more spastus, with more extension or expansion, and with more, I would say, spastus is spread out more, and sachvus is more expansion. What this simply means, just to use the example of the teacher and the student, when a teacher is teaching a student and progress is made, what's happening? Besides the fact that the student is receiving, as he understands more,
he's receiving more levels of oir from the teacher. As they grow, the teacher reveals more, and the student could understand more. But that's all the oir haseichel. But there's something else happening at the process. The very kalim, the brain, the mind of the student is becoming more primed, becoming more refined. It's just like any talent. When you teach somebody, for example, carpentry or how to play an instrument, in the beginning, they're going to be very rough and they'll be able to do a little. What happens when a person gets more trained? Besides the fact that there's more oil flowing, the very kalim are now far more primed and far more experienced. And you see someone sitting at a piano who's played piano for many years. You see the flow. It's like seamless. And you clearly see that the kalim themselves, their fingers, their very body, their entire keli is also completely part of the seamless process of the music it's creating. So besides the fact that more oir is coming, and we've expanded, more oir is being revealed, it's also that the keli has become more refined, that it can now receive. Like he says here, they become better kelim to receive it, which is really, in essence, just a Hasidic way of saying how a talent is developed. Whether it's a talent, like I just said, in the arts, or in music, or for that matter, sports. Even if we're not, and I'm giving examples, secular examples, and all of them, what is real good training and conditioning? That in addition to being able to create more, that your very containers, your habits, your routines, people who've trained, for example, to juggle. It's not just that they're able to juggle, their movements, their hand movements, their hand and eye coordination, or other things necessary, have the kalim themselves have become trained to the point that they are now receiving, like he said, they're refined to the point, to use the words, to receive more of the oir, and of course that causes the oir. So in addition to the being more oir, the keli also is conducively being able to receive all of that. And now again, this is all in the language of Chassidus, but if you apply it to simple examples, it's quite clear what he's talking about. If you don't apply it, it remains an abstract idea, as I've always pointed out. So now he's going to go back to what he spoke about, if you recall, on page 1312. If you remember when he spoke about kalim, so he spoke about when he was doing all the summations from different Maimorim. So he spoke, what did he speak about there? He's talking about that there's an oir within the keli, there's the oir that's higher than the keli. So at some point, he said, this is also what creates the structure of Milo Mato, the hierarchy. But after that, he also introduced Chesenius HaKelim and Primus HaKelim, that in every sphere, there's the outer container and there's the inner part of the container. The outer container is more, like he said, like levushim, that conceals more. The inner container, in order to be able to bring down the energy further down. And the Primus HaKeli is more to receive the oir. So he's going to now refer to the Primus HaChetzenis HaKelim and say the following. I'm reading on. That the outer keli, which initially, before there was any avodah, before there was any work and training and conditioning that we're discussing now, so what did we have? The oir enters into a keli, just like you have the faculties enter inside, the faculty of vision inside the eye, or the faculty of hearing inside the ear, and there's a oir in a keli. The outer part of the keli is meant to limit the flow, so it should be able to be extended outward, just like a cup. You can pour the water, you can pour wine or pour the liquid to another person, give it to another person. What happens, however, when you refine the containers? So he says, so the process, as we've been learning, is as when you're dealing with undeveloped universe, and we haven't yet done any avodah, so you're going to get a certain amount of flow of energy. Just like a human body that's not necessarily exercised or specially conditioned, can walk, can run, but to a certain limited amount. When you exercise the kalim become more refined, they become more primed, they become more ethereal in a way. So now they can draw more energy. So the same thing, the Chetzenis Akeli, whose role was really just to keep the flow, to make sure that the energy reaches the next level, like the teacher to the student. So now when the Kelim are more refined, the Chetzenis Akelim, in them radiate the Begilui, Kamei B'chinas Primis Akeli. But that's due to the work that we did. And of course, the Primis Akeli also elevates, and it can receive more from the levels that are higher than the regular energy that goes into even the Primis Akeli. Doesn't say that explicitly, but that's obviously all part of the process. But here he wants to show that the outer container now has become like the inner container. And the second half of it, that it doesn't just remain that way in Atzilus, remember when he spoke about this in the previous page, he made it clear. It's not just that we elevate and the itself is a higher but it also comes down into Biyah. The end of the paragraph on page 1313, he said that explicitly. So on one hand, you're elevating the containers, like he said, in Atzilus itself, that they receive a higher level of right? And to the Etzema and then that Shiyeh Gileh Gam Be'elim is Biyah, and that should come down below. So it also, all these higher qualities, that all this more refined state also come down even to the lower levels. And again, one of the best examples is the student and teacher. As the student grows, it's not just he's reaching higher levels of understanding, his very kalim have become refined to the point that even as what was yesterday a more outer container has become closer to being a more inner one, similar. And it also affects his whole being, his whole personality, his whole person, the student, has been elevated, which means that this refinement process has affected and changed him dramatically. It's not just some change on an internal level, but he's now a wiser student to the point that he can become at some point just like his teacher. So we're talking about a process of transformation ultimately. But the transformation here is, the focus here is on the Oyer. Even as the Keli gets more refined, it's still all focusing on the Oyer as he's going to emphasize shortly. Okay, and this Gili comes also in Biyah. V'hainu, and this means the Gam B'Biyah Yi'u v'Chayui v'Gamu Echad Kamei B'Atzilus. That even in Biyah will now be elevated to a higher state of unity with godliness. So initially we learned from the Zohar, he made it clear on the bottom of page 1312 that in the Tikkun Ezer, that in Bria is lav ihu v'chayui v'garmui echad. It's only in Atzilus that you have the seamless Merkava, 24/7 flow, seamless energy of the divine flowing through the containers. And in Biyah, there's already an independent consciousness. Yes, it's aligned with God, but it's through effort, and so on. Here, the Avodah has led Biyah to be elevated to a state of Atzilus, that this union has now also permeated Biyah. As we explained earlier, that even the Eir HaNeshama of Biyah on its own is a lower level than Atzilus. Explained that at the bottom of 1312. Because that comes from the outer containers of Malchus of Atzilus. It's not at all the way it is in Atzilus. And we learned that that's the meaning, that it's not Chiyu v'chayu echad. But now through Aveda, we can achieve and elevate that even that it should become on that level. Like he explains it. According to the regular flow of the cosmic order, like we learned Kav Hamida, the regular measure. So what's the story? Lav iyu v'chayu v'gamu echad. It's not God is one with his energies and containers in Biyah. But through the work, Birur, through the effort, through our effort down below, through the separation and the clarification and the elevation of the sparks, Nimshach, that changes things. That draws down, Shagam B'Biyah, that even in the world of Biyah, that on its own, it's not that type of seamless connection to godliness. That also Biyah should join and become connected in that way. But that's dafka through avodah. That does not happen on its own. That's our work. Then we elevate. So we see clearly that we're not only we're refining the containers and expanding the oil all the way that it comes down to beyond now. Similar to what I spoke about, that there's when you do a mitzvah, you're drawing down divine energy of kedusha, of holiness. When you take divrei rishus, like eating and drinking or other matters of chayil, mundane matters, and you direct it toward godliness, you're extending the sanctity also into matters that are like, so biyah compared to Atzilus is like weekdays compared to Shabbos. So Shabbos is a Shabbos Kodesh, but the weekdays are not called Kodesh; they're called weekdays. Ben Mahavdil, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chayil. We separate between Kodesh and Chayil, but when we take Chulin and we do it al Taras HaKodesh, we sanctify even our Chayil, even our mundane. We're expanding the boundaries of Kedusha, of holiness, and the Eir is now reaching, of Atzilus is reaching also into Biyah. That's why we say when Mashiach comes, Yem Shekulei Shabbos u'Menucha l'Chai Elamim. It'll be the whole time will be Shabbos, because everything will be elevated to that level. Today, it's the work that we do to refine and sanctify existence, but that's all the ultimate will be then. So that's what he's saying right now. And a little more on this topic, he says, V'hainu, in the parentheses, this means, Shenimshech mebchinas mohusa atzilus, liyas b'chinas eira neshama. Till now, in Seder Ishtalshus, we learned that even the eira neshama, even the higher level of biyah, the soul, neshama, not ruach and chay, which are lower, ruach and nefesh, lower. But even neshama is still the mitzias of elikus. And the muhus eir eliki, the very personality of the divine energy is exclusively designated to Atzilus. But through Aveda, now we're drawing the muhus. What he's saying. The personality of Atzilus is also now informing the Eira Neshama of Biyah. So he's just translating again into more the Chassidus Eisius to understand what's going on here. That's now also reaching that personality. And so to go back to the example of student and teacher, or I want to also use the example of the artist and the art. In the beginning, the art tells you about the existence of the artist. In the beginning, the student learns the teachings of the ideas of this teacher, but he doesn't necessarily yet know the personality of those ideas or the personality of the teacher himself. But as we grow and we refine our containers, what happens? You start getting acclimated and becoming more familiar and aware, not just of the mitzias, the existence of the godliness, but also of the personality that is invested in all of this. And that Aveda brings that awareness that was only in Atzilus till now also into Biyah, into the existence as we know it more, into the existence where there's already an independent consciousness, which is called the world of Biyah, the Yesh. And he continues that this is not just affecting the Eira Neshama of Biyah, va'af gam hakelim de Biyah. And also, and additionally, the kelim of Biyah. Because till now you could say, okay, fine. The Neshama, Eira Neshama Biyah, till now is not Yu v'chayu ichad, Ir garmu ichad. Now it is. But what about the kelim of Biyah? So he says, no, this is also permeating the containers of Biyah. Yu b'bchinas chad. They too will be in the state of oneness. Now, of course, you could ask the question, what will happen to Atzilus then? Obviously, Atzilus is now elevated to be able to receive energy that's higher than the Eiris and Kelim. So Atzilus has also, of course, been elevated. So everything is now in a higher state. So now Biyah has become what Atzilus was before, and Atzilus is become obviously something that Atzilus didn't have before. It's also elevated. He doesn't say this explicitly, but it's just implicit in the discussion of all of this. Like I mentioned yesterday, that it says in the Medrash that when Mashiach comes, all of Israel will spread to the entire world, and all of Yerushalayim will spread to Israel. Because the Mishnah says there are Esser Kadeshis Hain. There are 10 levels of holiness. The highest level is the Holy of Holies. Then there's the Kodesh. Then there's the Beis Hamikdash. Then there's Yerushalayim. Then there's Israel, etc. There's 10 levels. So what will happen is that it will extend the boundaries of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael will extend to the entire world, will become like Israel is today.
And Israel will become like Yerushalayim is today. Yerushalayim will become like the Beis Hamikdash. And of course, the Beis Hamikdash and the Kodesh Kodashim, all of them will be channeling higher levels. So everything gets elevated to that type of level and place. It just brings to mind the famous story, which works the other way around, but it could help us understand this. I'm not sure. They tell the story about different people. Anyway, there was this tremendous masmid who, in his younger years, would learn Torah every waking hour. So if he was up 22 hours a day, he would learn 22 hours. As he got older, and he was not as strong, so his family and the people were telling him, why don't you rest a little more, and you don't have to learn 22 hours a day or 21 hours a day. You can go down to 20, to 19, to 18. No, and he insisted no. And he explained when they asked him why. He says, it's not because of me alone. I want to learn Torah all the time. It's because the life is structured in a way like a ripple effect. If I go down from 22 to 21, so someone else who learns 1 hour a day is going to go down an hour as well. A person who learns 1 hour a week, he'll go down an hour as well. And somewhere in America, a Jew who goes once a year to Yom Kippur to Shul will stop going. In other words, everything affects everything. Everything is relative. So that's in the negative way. And the positive is also true, that when we do something down below and we refine, it creates that ripple effect I was explaining earlier in all levels, that everything elevates to yet another higher level. That's what it means, that your one act can tip the scales. Now, obviously, different people are on different levels, but it has that type of effect that causes that ripples through all of the shtalshus, like we're explaining here. Okay. So also the kelim u'kamoisha kosa b'teira eir pasha boy b'dibur hamaschel be'etzem hayom hazeh. So he's actually giving us the source. Where does it say this? That in the Maimer and Torah eir from the Alter Rebbe, in boy and the Maimer be'etzem hayom hazeh, it speaks about that the kelim of biyah two will become one through our avodah. And the parentheses, he connects it to Shabbos. If you remember back in the last page, he talked about when he cited earlier the 3 stages in Shabbos, Maila Shabbato, and the Birurim of the weekdays of Biyah and Atzilus. Essentially, Biyah generally associates with the weekdays and Atzilus with Shabbos. So he's now saying, he's bringing that, and I believe in the Maimer Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh in Torah, he mentions that as well. The Kamoi Ba'ali is the Shabbos, like it is in the elevations of Shabbos. The B'yem HaShvi, on the 7th day, Nis'ala. Then on the 7th day, the world get elevated. V'yeshev al kisei kvede, and it says that he sits on the throne of glory, of his glory. What does that mean? In Ruchnius, Shakelim de Bria, which is the throne. They come from Bria because the world of Elam HaKisei is the throne. The king that sits on the throne is the Adam HaElyon of Atzilus. So, V'yeshev al kisei kvede, Shakelim de Bria, Elam b'Atzilus, which means that the containers of Bria elevate to Atzilus. Umeir umisachet behem ha'er Atzilus. And the energy of Atzilus radiates and gets united with them. So he says, so just as it is in the Aliyahs, as it elevates, Biyah elevates and goes up. The same thing is afterwards when it comes down, Atzilus and the Eir of Atzilus also comes down and permeates Biyah. As we learned, there's both the elevation part and there's the drawing down. As we discussed, and when you go back to the volume 2, he talks about it more in detail. So on Shabbos, all the worlds are elevated. Biyah is elevated to Atzilus. And after Shabbos, the energy of Shabbos permeates the weekdays, the way it's meant to be. Just to give an example, there was a chassid who came once to the Frierdiker Rebbe. And it was the middle of the week. And he said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, he'd like the Rebbe to say a Maimer Chassidus, to say a discourse. And the Rebbe said to him, there's a designated time. On Shabbos, I say a Maimer Chassidus. And the chassid responded, when I come to the Rebbe, for me, it's like Shabbos. And just in case, the Gemara Taka says, Talmud Chacham, Ikra Shabbos. a scholar, a Torah scholar, is called Shabbos. That's why a Rebbe wears Shabbos clothing all week long, even though he changes the clothing for Shabbos because everyone has to do that and elevate even to a higher level. You can imagine if all week a Rebbe is like Shabbos, so Shabbos is obviously like Shabbos. It means a Shabbos b'Shabbate, like a Shabbos within Shabbos. And we know there's levels. Yom Kippur is called a Shabbos within Shabbos. So the point being is that you see here that you can have the level of Shabbos in the weekday. Obviously, it doesn't mean halachically that you don't work and other things. But the Kedusha, the holiness of Shabbos, and the Frierdiker Rebbe complied and said a Maimer Chassidus. In other words, it wasn't just a nice, cute expression. He said a Maimer to him because he drew out of him that level of Shabbos, even though it was in the weekday, and he said the Maimer Chassidus. The point being is that the goal of all of this is constantly to elevate ourselves. So for some people, weekday is weekday, Shabbos, Shabbos. Some people in the weekday, they bring a certain Shabbos-dik energy into it. Obviously, when it comes Shabbos, Shabbos will be even higher. So the point is that this goes both through Aliyah and Amshachet, Rotzeh and Shuv. That first there's the elevation, and then you draw it down. Remember the Rebbe explaining Havdalah. We say Mavdil ben Kodesh Lachel. You say in Havdalah. Now Havdalah sounds like it's separated. You're making a distinction that the weekday is not like Shabbos. But the Rebbe explained that in Kedusha and holiness, even a separation is also a way of connecting. When you, for example, say that the Holy of Holies is to be separated from the holy, it's not a separation as in abandonment, as in disconnection. On the contrary, you're appreciating the boundaries. When Hashem said to Moshe, tell the Jews by Matan Torah that they should not get closer to the mountain, so everyone interprets it because they were not worthy. The point is, no, you recognize where you are. Once you know the distinction between a Kohen, a Levi, and a Yisrael, between Holy of Holies and Holy, then you're actually connecting them. Just to give an example, the human body, if all the organs in the body decided, let's all connect, let's all become one, what would you have? Destruction. The windpipe and the food pipe have to be two separate pipes. And that's how they work. They have to coordinate that way. Coming one does not make them better. Appreciating the boundaries, the inherent boundaries of existence is the way that you actually unite things, not separate them. If you say everyone should be a clone of each other and we all have to have the same opinion, that's not creating unity. That's creating destruction because you're destroying the diversity that we have. So appreciating the diversity actually makes it into a container, a keli, to create unity. So the Havdalah of Chodesh Echel, now that you know this is Shabbos and this is weekday, now you can say, let's bring the holiness of Shabbos into the weekday. If someone will say, every time I do a mundane thing, it's like Shabbos, that's a distortion. They'll never then really appreciate what real Kedush is. First, you need to know it's holy. Then you could say, oh, now that I know it's holy, now I can bring that holiness into my less holy part of my life. But once you convince yourself, like Korach's mistake was that. He didn't want boundaries. He said, why are you lifting yourself up than everybody? Everybody is holy. Yes, fundamentally, in essence, everybody is holy. We're all a chelik elakam and mal mamish. But there's a difference between a Talmid Chacham and someone who's not, between a tzaddik and someone who's not. You need to know there's a tzaddik, a beinani, a rasha. That's not meant to separate us. It's meant to be real, to be honest. Once you respect the diversity and now you say, okay, I know that you're my teacher and not the student is the teacher, then the student can start aspiring to become like the teacher. It's like the Alter Rebbe once said, that the person has to know how great they are, how small they are and how great they can become. There's some people who have delusions of grandeur. They know how great they can become, but they don't know how small they are. And there are others who don't know how great they can become. They only know how small they are. So to really grow, you need to know where you are, but you also need to know you're capable of going higher. And if one of them is distorted, you're not going to grow. So it's important to know that you're not there yet. And that helps you. If you convince yourself I'm already there, you won't do anything about it. And you won't necessarily ever really appreciate what it means to be there, meaning on that higher spiritual level. I'm just explaining how you can reconcile both the distinction between Shabbos and weekday and also bring Shabbos into the weekday when you have this bittul that I'm describing here, both elevating and drawing it down.
And all this is through the refinement of our work and our avodah, the birur hanetzutzis and halos hanetzutzis, and to the point that even the containers of biyah now have been elevated and also draw down the atzilus within them. To the point that also below, what he probably means here is not just in biyah, but even to the lowest worlds, we should also have this level of Gili Elikus, Gili Eir. And now he sums up what he was saying in the last section. So let me sum it up and then we'll stop for questions. V'zehu, shemeisif u'marchiv, you're going back to the words of the Rab Nachum Chernobyl, the beginning of the subject, where he spoke about v'zehu shemeisif u'marchiv, that he adds, increases, and expands. Mokim HaKdusha, the domain, the territory of holiness. Shezehu, one second. You know what? Before I read on, I will stop here because he's going to, I want to explain the next lines and I don't want to. So right now, that's what he's saying. So this is how you expand it. And he's going to explain the details of it and sum it up. And we'll finish the paragraph, but I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay, if not, we'll just continue reading. So this is the meaning that we add and expand the territory or the domain of holiness, of sanctity, kedusha. Shezeu bebeis inyonim, b'chinas teisvus eir hameruba ala iker. Oh, okay. I'm trying to figure out what the two things are. It sounds to me the two things are going to be, one is that you increase in eir, and the second that you actually bring it into the kelim. I think these are the two things he's saying. Beis inyonim, the first thing, b'chinas teisvus eir hameruba ala iker. Now he's referring back to what he's mentioned, that this is an abundance of eir that wasn't there, that was not revealed before. And more than that, meruba ala iker. It's even more. It's not just 10% increase. It's over 100% increase because you're now adding a lot more than there was there originally. That's what the birur does. The hainu, what does that mean in ruchnius? B'chinas etzem ha'er k'meishu l'mayla me'kav hamida. The etzem ha'er, like we said, that's higher than that was measured according to the measuring flow of the kav hamida. That was there initially. No, there was an initial amount of energy that God designated and allocated to Atzilus or to any given level. Now through Aveda, we've increased that. The taste was more than the Sheirish. Meruba ala iker. So that's the Etzem Ha'er that before was concealed from the Kalim. And now they're there. That sounds like the second thing. And the second thing is, sounds like, I may be wrong, but I'm almost sure that's the two in Yonim. The second is that's what he said before. I'm going back to the words where he said v'oidzos. So the v'oidzos is like a second thing that extends and expands the air all the way down below. So on one hand, it's drawing higher level of energy that wasn't there before. And the second that is bringing it down lamata mata, below, all the way down. Kinasu kelim ela eir. Because the kelim became more refined containers to the eir. Shebchinas etzem ha'eir yispashid v'yizgala b'yesed ad lamata. So he's combining both things now. That this level of etzem ha'eir, the eir, that was essentially the eir that was in the domain of the artist, of the creator, and not in the domain of the student or the recipient, because it was higher than Istapsus and Kelim, is now being drawn and extending and being revealed all the way lamata, where before it was not accessible in that sense, in that way. So those are the two things in the expansion of the Eir HaKdusha, that it's higher levels, deeper levels, and comes all the way down.
That's the lashon for Reb Nachum, moisif u'marchiv.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Just for the record, it's not very often Chassidus quotes from Rab Nachum Chernobyl. I mean, there are places that it quotes. Here's one of them. Yeah. V'zeu gamkein. The Rebbe Rashab is adding one more piece just to fill the picture in of the same idea. So there's expression in Vayechi when Yaakov blesses Yosef, he says, Ben Peiris Yosef. So the question is, what does Peiris mean? So here he's teaching Peiris from the letters Peiris, Asius Peiser. So Peiser is like when you say Peiser Chalemis, when someone interprets a dream. It's a pitaron. It's like a solution. It's an interpretation. So Yosef was a Peiser. What does that mean? He will reveal things. He revealed things that were concealed. So on Ben Peiris Yosef, Yaakov is referring to Yosef doing that. That what did he do? Because the netzutzes are like hidden sparks that are hidden, and Peiser means that you are interpreting and revealing what they are. And that's what Yosef did. He was in Mitzrayim. The other brothers, including the others, they were shepherds and they remained in Israel. It was Yosef went to Mitzrayim and he was involved in what? In the matters of the commerce. First, he was an accountant for Potiphar, and then he became the viceroy and managed that whole superpower of developing the grain industry. And yet he maintained his connection to godliness. So it was the ultimate birur of netzutzis. And we learned before that when there's birur on netzutzis, what happens? Through that, ubchinas taste v'seir. The birur on netzutzis creates an abundance of air. It's like we spoke with the Gan Eden. There's the amount that Gan Eden grows and bears and produces a certain amount of harvest on its own. But then through the work and hard work and Aveda, means the birur on netzutzis, you produce a lot more taste v'seir. Which is also the name Yosef, comes from the word Hesafa. He adds taste an increased and a additional and increased amount of energy. So both the name Yosef and Peiser are all connected to this idea. The Gam, additionally, and Yosef ubchinas gili ha'er lamata. So that's Yosef. He's revealing deeper and higher levels. Taste was said, but we said there's another aspect. He also brings it down below. So he's also bringing the second thing. Gili ha'er. He brings it down below. As it says, Ela tel this Yaakov Yosef. So the question is, why only Yosef? There were other children. Besides and of course the question, why was he his favorite? And Chassidus explains, because Yosef was unique. He was the Teldus, even though it's Teldus Lashon Rabim, the children, but Yosef was the one that carried. What does an offspring do? What do children do? They carry the father's energy to a lower level. Yosef epitomized that because he brought that Atzilus of Yaakov and the others, Shemamshich Gili B'Biyah. He brought it in Biyah, and we see it in his life. He brought into Mitzrayim the Gilui Elikus that until then was only in Eretz Yisrael by Yaakov. So Ela told us Yaakov Yosef that Yosef was the level of Yesod that says in Chassidus. Here he doesn't bring it right away. It doesn't bring that thing, but Yosef was like the channel, the bridge between Yaakov and Mitzrayim. That's why there's a very powerful Sikha Vayechi, Tov Mem Zayin. The Rabbi asked the question, just as Yaakov asked to be buried not in Egypt, they shouldn't turn him into a shrine, but in Ma'aras HaMachpelah and Chevron with his parents and with Leah. Why didn't Yosef ask the same thing? Why did Yosef remain in Mitzrayim? And the Rebbe explained, because Yosef's inyan is the birur of Mitzrayim. So he had to remain with the Jews and also give them the hope, because he made them vow, take an oath, that when they leave this place, they'll take Atzomis Yosef, as they do in Beshalach. They take the bones of Yosef with them. So when Yosef, as long as he remained there with them, they always saw him as like a symbol that gave them the hope and the chayis that they would ultimately leave Mitzrayim. Because in Inyan was the birur of Biyah, not just the birur of Atzilus, not the Gili of Atzilus, but bring it into Biyah. Just to add to this point. For who Ayideh Birurim? And this to Mimshach in Biyah is through Birurim, which is Ben Peiris Yosef's role of Birurim, Ukameshakosha b'mokim acher. like it says elsewhere. So this final piece captures the same idea. It's interesting. Before he said Ela tell this Yitzchak, which was the Birurim Tzutzis that Yitzchak ve'Ela tell this, I should say. That was the Torah of Rab Nachum Chernobyl. And now he's also, and then comes the next generation, Yaakov, they'll tell this Yaakov Yesod to bring it into Biyah. So there's something similar, like the tale this, I'm just thinking out loud. There's the tale this Yaakov and Esav. But here clearly goes even to a lower level into Biyah that Yesod brings. Okay. Okay, so that concludes the paragraph. And let's pause here. Let's stop here if anybody wants to ask anything or clarify anything.
The Sefer Moire Naim is from Reb Nachum Chernobyl, correct?
Yeah, correct.
This is brought 4 times in Chassidus. The Rabbi brings it also down.
Yeah, he brings the Moire Naim also. No, but there's another Moire Naim from Pinchas.
Baal HaFloah.
Not Baal HaFloah, the Pinchas Koritza maybe. You know, the Moire Naim in Bolok, that there's a Mashiach, on Dorach Kechiv Miyakov, there's a Mashiach B'chol Echad. There's also, I don't think that's Abnach. I think there's a second Moire Naim. Anyway, but yeah, I believe Moire Naim is from Rab Nachum. Chassidus brings, there's different, you know, a few places Chassidus brings. There's also the famous story with Rab Nachum that the Friedrich Rebbe brings in the Maimer, that he became shaman, he became heavy from saying Amen Yesh Me Rabba. Listen, Rab Nachum Chernobyl was a great, yeah.
It was a Zayda from Friedrich Rebbe also.
Yeah.
Alter Rebbe and he made a shidduch because the Maggid said Mashiach will come or from his oldest students or from his youngest. So Rab Nachum was the oldest, Alter Rebbe was the youngest. So they said, let's make a shidduch.
Who is Rab Nachum's teacher? Who is his?
The Maggid.
Maggid?
And the Malshav also, but the Maggid.
Okay. Now, Rabbi Nachum Chernobyl was not related to the Baal Shem Tov. That was Baruch Mezhebush. That was
Rabbi was Ayin.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions on this? What we've learned today? I think it's pretty straightforward. So I'm ready to continue. Why not? Let's continue. So now comes the qualification. Kol zeh. However, all of this that we discussed now is all obviously unbelievable transformation and unbelievable revelation that comes through Avodah to bring from Atzilus into Biyah. However, Kol zeh b'chinas hisofas v'archovas gvul hagdusha. All this is additional, an expansion of the boundary of holiness. You're talking about Kedusha, so instead of it being reserved to Atzilus or to Shabbos or to a particular area, we've expanded now into Biyah and into the mundane through the elevation of the sparks. The Hainu b'chinas ha'er shemiseisav be'etzem husei. And here he says clearly, both things. That this, which means the divine energy that was increased, the etzem husei, because that very fundamental energy is now coming from a higher level, the etzem ha'er, and ubabchinas hispashtus v'izgala shalei, and also its extension and its revelation all the way downward. Remember, he said both things. So it's also reaching a higher level, a deeper level of Eir, and also its expansion. So all this is Gvul HaKdusha being expanded, both in quality and in reach. But, so what's the Omnom? Because ve'ein zeh adayin shanetzutzes atzman me'erim mitzad atzma. This is not yet the level that the sparks themselves are radiating on their own. And I explained what that meant. Even though a spark seems to be, by definition, light, but here he's using sparks in the context. You've elevated that the sparks have returned home, so to speak. They have now added to the big light of divine revelation, not just Natzilas, but also in Biyah, also in Lamata, in this lowest of world, the Kalim. But
the sparks themselves, as they identify with below and relate, are not rating on their own. They're all part of the bigger Eir. And so therefore, at the end, like he said before, earlier on top of the page, I just want to bring it all together. He said these words, that Kol Zman, Omnam Ba'amiti Se'inyan, Kol Zman Shelo Yigia Lezel Liyas Ishapcha Chashech L'Nehera, that even with all this expansion of Eir, all the way into Biyah, you think that's already Mashiach, the highest level. But as long as they don't have the transformation, Ein Zeh Shanitzuzes Atzman Me'irim. I'm reading from the 10th line from the top of the page. Ki'im rak ma shegein mim teisvis eris. So he says essentially the same thing, just to clarify. So yes, that increases energy, absolutely. Etzem ha'er, and that it comes down below. But it's not that they themselves are revealing a higher dimension of the divine. They are adding. It's just like resistance causes that there should be more gili. But it's not that the resistance itself is revealing. It's the resistance is causing that more oil should flow. What does that mean? That through the birur that work below, the milchama, and the battle of extracting and freeing the sparks and elevating them, more oil. But then there's another thing called transforming them themselves. And he says this is now even higher than Yosef. The parentheses. Shezeu mailis Yehuda al Yosef. Yosef is a sofa, an additional amount of energy, Ben Peres Yosef, Pesach, everything we just said. But then there's Yehuda who even has a quality over Yosef. What is that? That is V'hu Inyan Mashiach, V'David Avdi Nosi Aleim. David comes from Beis Yehuda. This is the Haftarah of Vayigash. So Yosef was talking the leader then, and Yehuda received from him. But then ultimately, like the Haftarah says, there'll be two branches, the Eitz Yehuda, Eitz Yosef, and ultimately it'll be David will be greater. Who Avdi Nosi Aleim, a servant that will be Nosi, will be the leader of them all, the Nosi of them all. Ad David Higdil, which, like we say in the Haftarah that we learned earlier, V'nefkadato Yipoka de Melcher Chedesh, David Higdil, that David will become great. Like it says elsewhere in Yenison and David. Now, the truth is, he more or less hinted to it earlier when we learned it on page 1304, where he spoke about the elevation of Malchus of David. So I'm not sure why he doesn't refer to that, but
which is Yosef. Yenison is Yosef.
Yeah. So that will be that David will ultimately climb. Now, this is just a parenthesis because the Rebbe Rashab is just hinting to that it is even higher than Yosef, and that is the real transformation. That will be Yehuda, but that we'll understand that better when we learn further. So on the top, we just moved to the top of page 1315. So this is not the netzutzes themselves radiating. Ki'im, line 2, masha'ideh netzutzes nimsha b'chinas teis v'seh. They're rather serving like a springboard, that through the sparks, nimshach is drawn an additional amount, teisvis, an abundance, or an additional amount of oir, even though it's a very high oir that comes all the way below. And why is this the case? Why is it not the case that through this work we actually transform? He says, "V'kol zeh," and all this is due to a fact, mipnei sha'ba'aveda lamata, because in the service below that we've been discussing till now, b'bchinas habirur v'zichuch, in the separation and the clarity, v'zichuch and refinement of the sparks from lamata, from in the lowest worlds, ein zeh b'bchinas hishapcha mamash. That this Aveda is not mamash hishapcha. It's not literally transformation of the darkness of the darkness below. Shari masha bizgalus akeches the nefesh alikis, because that which we learned without because the revelation of the faculties of the divine soul, because that's where the oir is coming from. Remember the hisbananus and the midas that are stimulated through contemplating on godliness. That's the isgalus of the faculties of the divine soul. That causes a weakness. It weakens and subdues the faculties of the animal soul. The animal soul on its own desires and is tempted and drawn to material things, the crassness of El Mazeh Gashmi Vachumni. And what does the Nefesh Elikis counter? Through the Aveda, we're weak in that hold. But he qualifies. Didn't we also say that the Nefesh Abamis has also been convinced and been also affected that it should want? He says, and also that which we discussed, that the animal soul too was explained and trained by the divine soul, should come to a level of ava, love, and rotze, and longing, or yearning. That's not that the animal soul has been fundamentally transformed or fundamentally sublimated. It only affected the nefesh abamis in its expression, in its extension. But the animal soul itself has not been fundamentally transformed. Like the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya. What does he say in Ayin Beis? That even when you daven, and even when the divine soul is very much in control, and it even has the animal soul being part of it. But he says that's only affecting the thought, speech, and action. Not the etzem keiches. The keiches of the animal soul remain dormant like asleep. And what's in control of the irktana of the human being then is the divine soul. But can you say that the animal soul has been transformed? No, it's been convinced and it's going along, and it even appreciates and also has a love for God. But as soon as you finish davening, he says it starts waking up again. In other words, you haven't really fully transformed the animal soul. So the difference between etzem and ispashtus, you can, for example, you can have someone that was your opponent, and then for whatever reason, you're able to convince them that they should go along with a plan that you made. And they go along. Let's say they work with you, and they go along, and you're even successful. Have you really changed them? Because tomorrow, they still have not really become your full ally. They become your ally right now. That's called an ispashtus. Right now, for all practical purposes, they're working along with you. But you haven't fully transformed them to become a driving force for godliness on their own, completely on their own. So it's taka the nefesh elikis is better than just the divine soul controlling. It's also somewhat caused the nefesh abamis also to want godliness, but transforming of the etzem of the nefesh abamis, that has not happened yet. And even that which is now, so all this is still, it's being convinced. But even that which the animal soul is Meseder Mitzad Atzmei, we said clearly that it also begins to be stimulated on its own. He said that clearly on the top a few times. He said it on top of page 1314, very specifically, explicitly. He said also earlier that to explain it to the Nefesh Abamis, but better at the top of 1314, he says, nevertheless, so there's two stages here. There's three stages. There's the 4 stages, I should say. There's the darkness of the animal soul controlling everything. That's the world we live in before Aveda. Then comes the Aveda, and the Nefesh Elikis wakes up, start getting alive, and affecting that you should feel godliness that's hidden inside the world. Then the divine soul also speaks to and educates the animal soul that it also should agree. Then the animal soul not only agrees, but also on its own has a Chassidus. And yet that's not etzem muhuse. That's what he's saying now. It's not the etzem muhus. That's shenepach muhuse bezeh. That his fundamental personality has been transformed. Hagam shezer yesher be'etzem muhuse, even though it's more than when the divine soul on its own does it, because the animal soul is feeling a yearning for godliness. It's still not what we call transformation.
So because of time, I'm going to stop here, and I'll explain tomorrow what the difference would be. We're going to learn it at length, what means esapcha, but for all practical purposes, the example I gave is that you could have someone who's your adversary agree with you, and even on their own find interest in what you have on their own, but they have not been fundamentally transformed through and through. And that's going to be the ultimate level. So he's going to finish by saying, so all this is taka the birur v'zichuch. You're refining and you're elevating the animal soul, but it's not the full transformation that we're looking at, he ultimately wants to have here, which is going to be where the darkness itself becomes light. But we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow. But any questions? Any questions? No? Okay, so we're on top of page 1315. Aleph Shin Tezvav, on line, what was it, 7 lines from the top. Okay.